Chapter 5 Junction. The Greyhound bus lurched and shuddered, the engine groaning as the driver negotiated the road leading to the mountain pass. Out the window, the trees broke occasionally to reveal a home, each one a picture of rustic simplicity, with a low-slung wraparound porch, gravel driveway, and expansive yard shaded by spreading branches of sugar maples and red oaks. More than a few trees were hung with tire swings. Satellite dishes perched on rooftops and aimed south, towards satellites in equatorial orbits beaming HBO, FX, CNN. Kenya corrected herself. What was she thinking? These folks watched Fox. A wave of disdain passed over her, growing to disgust when she noticed a Trump-Pence sign. Weather-beaten and faded, but still triumphantly displayed in one of the passing yards. She turned her attention to the more immediate roadside, where another historical marker went by. These were sturdy iron signs, marking points of historical or scenic significance, mostly from the Civil War, although a few were from the Revolutionary era. But most, Kenya noted, were about patriots of the Confederacy: Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, John S. Mosby, and his riders. The Greyhound engine lulled for a moment as they crested through the pass, the Shenandoah Valley spreading out below them. It was hard not to feel a sense of awe at the purple walls of mountains that rose on the horizon in curves nearly indistinguishable from clouds at sunrise and sunset. The slopes enclosing the patchwork of fields and forests, threaded through by rivers streaming in the morning sun. Their meandering paths, mercurial in their twists and turns. Her brief search for Shenandoah Valley in Google Images had shown Kenya apple orchards, wineries, fieldstone mills with water wheels, and churchyards with gravestones that predated the United States, from days when the frontier was east of the Mississippi and colonists were just beginning to invade the lands of the Monacan and Cherokee. For a moment, however, she forgot the tortured history of the past and simply tried to focus on the beauty of the landscape unfolding beyond the guardrail the color of gunmetal. Her forehead tapped the window with a light bump as the bus turned around a bend. One of her newly plaited braids flattened between her head and the glass. She rolled another one in her fingers, still shiny with oil, her scalp still a bit sore from the process of pulling her hair tight to braid it. Hair, she thought, with a sigh. Was there any group of people in the world whose hair was more political than black women? She'd picked braids because they would be the least work during a summer where she did not expect to find a black hairdresser. She twirled the coarse braid between the pads of her fingers, wondering if they would be viewed as too informal or, the other extreme, too black. Incendiary, even. As if she were making some political statement. She knew the only statement she was making was one of convenience. If she had wanted to be political, she would have combed out a fro, but even that might have been lost on the whites she would be surrounded by. Likely, they would just want to touch it like she was some animal in a petting zoo. Her view was blocked by a stand of trees as they rounded another bend. When her view cleared again, a large estate slid into view. It was situated higher on the hillside, surrounded by terraced lawns, each with their own row of manicured bushes and trees, and outbuildings such as horse stables, multi-car garages, and guest cottages. The grounds had a commanding view of the valley, situated like a castle over feudal lands. She thought of the simpler homes in the hollows they had passed, with the tire swings, late-model pickup trucks, and gravel driveways. The bus turned again, and the mansion moved to the other side of the road. But still it loomed large, the property filling up the windows of the bus, revealing a pool, a driving range, and paved paths just the right width for golf carts. Kenya turned her back on it. The bus was not full, and the seat immediately next to her was empty. Across the aisle, a woman in a red North Carolina State University sweatshirt pointed out different cars in the opposite lanes and asked her son to name their colors. He had wide blue eyes, a mess of straw-colored hair, and an expressive face. Kenya had exchanged smiles with them both as she had boarded in Raleigh and had decided to sit across from them. When she had started to nod off and let drop her water bottle, sending it rolling down the aisle, the mother had caught and returned it. Now the bottle was empty. The water had passed through Kenya, and pressure was building in her bladder. She was relieved when the road leveled out on the valley floor and the driver slowed, pulling into a gas station with a decent-sized Quickie Mart and announced a rest stop. Kenya zipped her backpack closed, her laptop computer and tablet nestled inside, slung it on her shoulder, and followed the mother and her son down the aisle and off the bus. It was bliss to stretch her legs. The station was busy with Saturday morning shoppers who had come to the market, which was part grocery, part gardening center, part hardware store. Men in flannel shirts and baseball caps pumped gas into pickup trucks. The beds converted, with lockers and rails to hold tools, sheetrock and lumber. She passed by fuchsia, white, and lavender azaleas, their roots encased in potting soil and black plastic pots. Inside, on her way to the ladies' room, Kenya passed through an aisle with locally made salad dressings, salsas, and something she had never heard of, apple butter. But corporate branding was not to be left out. Additional aisles were chock full of puffy bags of Lay's potato chips, Slim Jims, Doritos, and pork rinds. Another had every candy bar variety imaginable, all sold in super sizes. The ladies' room was clean and efficient. Kenya waited her turn at the sink while a roundish white woman in mom jeans washed her hands and rubbed a smudge of lipstick from her teeth, which were yellowed from nicotine. When Kenya came back out, the line at the register had grown long with the passengers from the bus. The teenage girl behind the counter, thin to the point of anorexia, had Deadpool and Hellboy tattoos on her arms and neck, her lips and nose pierced with rings, her left ear with a rod. Kenya grabbed a bag of trail mix with almonds, peanuts, and yogurt-covered raisins and tried not to think about the added sugar content of the yogurt as she selected a bottle of coconut water. The line stretched down the toiletry aisle. Kenya took her place among the soaps, shampoos, and tampons, her eyes fixed on a product she had never seen before. A cardboard stand displayed packets of kits containing pills and powders that claimed to mask the trace of drugs in one's urine. "Pass any drug test," the sign proclaimed. She picked one up, turning the box in her hand. It promised to mask traces of amphetamines, opioids, and tetrahydrocannabinol. She returned it to the display, setting it beside a bottle of synthetic urine, also guaranteed to pass any drug screening. She stepped outside after paying and noticed a few men of retirement age, seated at a table, drinking coffee, their voices deep but mostly free of the Appalachian twang she had been expecting. The bus engine was running, but the driver was outside smoking a cigarette and texting on his phone. Kenya continued to stretch her legs, walking to the end of the bus, where she noticed another one of the iron historical markers. She approached it in order to read the black, raised lettering on the white backing, expecting another commemoration of a Civil War skirmish or fortification. But she was surprised to find it dated 1955 and dedicated to Ernest Cunningham. From Buffalo, New York, Ernest Cunningham was visiting relatives in nearby Stamford Springs, where he spoke to a 23-year-old white woman who was married to the proprietor of a local filling station. 3 days later, Ernest was abducted and beaten before being dragged several miles. His body was found hanging from a tree along the Stamford River, close to the crossroads informally known as the Junction. His case became a catalyst in the growing civil rights movement of the time, exposing the suffering of African Americans and the limitations of democracy. The rest was unreadable, for the groupings of bullet holes punched through the sign. The plastic bottle in her hand popped as her hand tightened around it. She had seen a number of speed limit and deer crossing signs similarly pockmarked. Hillbilly target practice. But as she stepped closer, she could see the unmistakable epitaph scratched into the paint with a car key. "Go home, nigger." She turned, walking at a staccato clip back to the bus, where the other passengers, all white, not a person of color among them except herself, were trundling on with their snacks, soft drinks, headphones, and smartphones. The chatter was upbeat. Could it have been any more oblivious and removed from the sensation roiling her stomach, even as the mother in the NC State sweatshirt smiled at her again? The young man in the seat in front of Kenia bobbed his head. She could hear him listening to Jay-Z, the same epitaph likely being wrapped in his ears. Kenya tried to get out of her head. This was the language written across the landscape of the United States, a history she knew to be soaked in blood from the vicious supplanting of the indigenous people onwards. She thought yearningly of Audrey and Haiti, then tried to pivot again, not letting her dark mood overtake her, determined not to let a barely literate, pickup-driving, tobacco-swirling bumpkin ruin her morning. She unzipped her bag, removed her tablet, and started scanning through article abstracts and their accompanying charts and captions, losing herself in data. These were the prevalence and mortality statistics she was accustomed to, lining up along the familiar fault lines of social economic status. The only difference in this case was that these data were coming from U.S. settings, not Zimbabwe, Angola, South Africa, or the other African countries she was used to studying. These charts and graphs reflected rates in countries of West Virginia, cross-tabbed by other demographics such as urban-rural, male-female, and date of birth in 10-year intervals. It was bleak, a 75% increase in mortality rates for women, mostly white, between the ages of 35 and 59. This was in contrast to the national mortality trends for men and women of color, which had, across the board, improved anywhere from 10 to 20% depending on the region. In the context of public health, it was an unprecedented spike in mortality, analogous to the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Like the first 20 years of the generalized epidemic, the middle generation of parents and breadwinners was hollowed out, leaving grandparents raising grandchildren. Kenya thought back to the Junction. The people she had seen there had been a representative cross-sample of different ages. She had seen young, middle-aged, and old, but she heard Audrey's voice in her head from their hours of studying biostats and epidemiology, reminding her that the sample at the Junction would have been biased. All those people were shopping and therefore had money to spend and were likely working. The men filling up their trucks, indeed, had looked as if they were headed to construction sites. She scrolled down the causes of death. The numbers painted a grim picture of drug and alcohol overdoses, vehicular accidents, alcohol-related, and suicide. It brought to mind the drug testing kits she had seen at the market. She let the tablet tilt back and lay flat on her legs and leaned her head against the window again. Anthropology classes had taught her to look at cultural trends and historical context, for these macro forces manifested themselves in the microcosm of the human body. From gene expression to allele length, For the past 2 years, she had thought of the forces of colonialism, capitalism, and slavery, and their lasting effects on communities of color. But the same forces had left their mark on the oppressing side, too. She thought back to her syllabus from her African American history course, a class which had been full of other Black students, 3 Latinos, 2 Asians, and a white girl trying her hardest to come across as woke. She remembered reading about how the slave system in Europe, for millennia, had been one of indentured servitude, where losers of war and debtors were made servants. The system had been imported in the Americas in the 1600s, where Black and white servants were initially viewed equally. Black and Irish both were considered a vile, brutish race of subhumans. Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion at Jamestown in 1676, uniting white and Black servants together in solidarity, much to the horror of the ruling class. But things changed after that. The rich saw to it, dividing the servant classes against each other. It was a toxic metamorphosis of the entire concept of slavery, one that created a 3-tiered caste system, one ostensibly based on ethnicity. Rich white landowners were elevated, but below them were poor, uneducated whites, to whom they granted slightly more privileges, slightly more power, and handed down strict guidelines as to how to interact with Blacks, to separate them socially and keep the lowest caste in their place. Poor whites could aspire to the life of the rich master class and have solidarity together because they were not Black, even if such social climbing was, in practice, exceedingly unlikely. The boost they received was more psychological than economic. Scientists, academics, and religious leaders conspired to reinforce justification for the racial categorizations. Craniologists documented differences in skull sizes, and religious leaders cited biblical verses, such as those describing the children of Ham as cursed. It was not unlike the way preachers in recent centuries justified discrimination against same-sex marriage, Kenia's sister China Murray had pointed out. But it was a feint, a trick played on the poor whites. They were still poor, and it was the fat cats, the landowners, who lived long, healthy, and educated lives. She saw it playing out now in the data at her fingertips, reflecting the lives in the valley, while the castle on the hill, with the swimming pools, driving ranges, and golf carts, simply sat and appreciated in value. Unfortunately for people of color, the system had been resilient, adaptable, and anything but self-correcting, as it pitted poor whites against Blacks, instilling the least educated, least privileged whites with municipal powers to enforce control over Blacks. She remembered lectures on the night riders, pseudo-police who would ride the roads of the South harassing Blacks for their traveling papers, killing runaways, or kidnapping freed slaves and sending them back into bondage. The Klan was only the most organized and infamous, immortalized in the first American film, Birth of a Nation, her brother pointing out to her how Hollywood did not like to admit that the first use of the close-up was in a film about white men heroically lynching a Black man. No one, at the time, seemed to have been bothered by the irony of the film's name, A Nation's Birth, centered on the oppression and murder of a Black man by white supremacists. It wasn't even subtle. Some things had changed over the decades, but some things remained pernicious, even more so for their thin veil of deniability in the age of colorblindness. But it was not hard for Kenia to draw the through line from the night riders, the Klan nights, to police shooting any number of unarmed Black boys and men. Amadou Diallo, Sean Bell, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Alton Sterling, or others who had died by other means in police custody, such as Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, and Eric Garner. Just the week before, a video had trended in which an 84-year-old grandmother was handcuffed while a SWAT team broke into her house looking for her son. Face down on the floor and non-resisting, the officers pepper-sprayed her anyway, her cries over the chaos of the shaky video echoing the cries of so many of her ancestors throughout the centuries. "Lord, please protect me!" Audrey, who had sent her the video, insisted that the cops wouldn't even be needed to enforce racial order in Trump's America, citing the militia movements in the upper Midwest, the Rockies, and the Pacific Northwest and other rural areas where whites with diminishing opportunities for jobs clung to guns and ethnicity as pseudo-tribal markers, blaming immigrants and other outgroups for their plight, instead of the very politicians who played on their ignorance and prejudice to win their votes. Mix in a bit of toxic masculinity, a dash of xenophobia, and a pinch of sexism, of course, and there you had it. America becoming great again. Kenya sighed. She knew the system could serve everyone better. People of color, people of less privilege, white, black, brown, everyone. The prison industrial complex, fed by the war on drugs, had ensnared a generation of black men, but also white men and women who were jailed and made permanent third-class citizens as felons, whose records never went away, perpetuating an underclass that it was legal to discriminate against, not unlike Jim Crow. Biggest threat to American values is America itself. The man who penned the Declaration of Independence also owned slaves. And therein was the paradox, the contradiction at the heart of the United States. Kenya let out a long, deep sigh. Race in America. She could see parallels to so many other struggles and systems of oppression, such as Jews in mid-century Germany. But even in that case, the hurt turned back on itself. The oppressed seeing the faces of their oppressors everywhere, so that all conflicts become existential ones. And in the intractable nature of Israel-Palestine, Jews, formerly victims, were now considered persecutors themselves. The oppressed becoming oppressors. It was James Baldwin who she remembered saying that it's not the just souls of the oppressed at stake, but also the souls of the oppressors. One twisted their own humanity when they denied it in another. But they never see it that way. She had become lost in her head again, drawn into an orbit around a jumble of pain she felt little capacity for all of a sudden. Your head can be like a bad neighborhood sometimes, Audrey used to say to her. Don't go in there alone. She resolved again to clear her mind, this time putting her tablet away and plugging her headphones into her phone. She scrolled through album covers until she landed on Solange Knowles. She closed her eyes. It was the same music her mother listened to in the kitchen when unwinding from a long day. They were melodies she had associated with family life, playing in the background as her siblings lined up at the kitchen island, half in a book or magazine, half engaged in conversation. These were some of her happiest memories, but she also remembered times when she would not want to share the attention, when she did not want to compete with China Mary's intellect, Chikmara's flair, or her brother, who, as the little brother, was doted upon by the women in his family. She viewed that as her job, and she did not always like sharing it, since she imagined herself to be best at it. One evening, instead, she remembered slipping down off the stool and wandering down the hall to her father's study. The music still drifted throughout the house on the speakers mounted in each room, but she found her father lost in more physical labor. His frame, over 6 feet tall, was stretched up on a stepladder so that he towered over her, his head close to the ceiling. He held 2 nails in his mouth and had a pencil tucked behind his ear while he measured the wall, a level in one hand. When he was satisfied with the bubbles in the level, he slid the pencil out from behind his ear and made a few light marks on the wall.
"Hey, Kenia, honey, what's going on?"
he asked, his voice slightly slurred from the nails in his teeth. "Nothing," she said. "What are you doing?"
"Hanging a picture. You want to help?"
"Yes."
"Hand me the hammer on the desk, please, baby."
She stepped around the ladder and picked up a hammer, resting on a stack of the Lancets, piled up next to the latest issue of The Economist, its cover folded back to reveal the leaders. She handed the hammer up to her father, and he tapped in the nails with a mixture of delicacy and force.
"All right,"
he said, coming down one step.
"Now, really carefully. Can you hand me that picture?"
This was a much more important task, Kenya knew, because pictures in their frames and glass were fragile. She picked it up. It was heavy and wider than her shoulders, and handed it up to her father. She imagined herself a nurse passing him a scalpel.
"Thanks, baby girl,"
he said, mirroring her care as he took the frame, turned it to the wall, and slid it into place until the braided metal wire caught behind it. He adjusted it slightly, the frame scraping against the drywall, and then he let it go, splaying out his fingers like a magician completing a trick.
"Perfect."
The stepladder squeaked as he climbed off, closed it, and set it against his desk. Next, he took Kenya up in his arms and held her up so they both could examine the picture on the same level. It was a large photo cropped closely around 2 black men. One man in the background was handsome, his smile possessing a relaxed movie star quality. He wore a fedora and a pressed suit and tie and looked directly into the camera. A second, younger-looking man, with broad athletic features and wearing a leather jacket, stood closer to the camera. He was the picture of concentration while he tried to sign something in his hand.
"Do you know who these men are?"
"No."
"That's Muhammad Ali, and that is Malcolm X. They were very famous in their time. Ali was the greatest boxer that ever lived, some say, and Malcolm was a great leader and speaker. His autobiography is one of my favorites, and you will have to read it when you are old enough."
She nodded, although it sounded boring. But if it made her father happy, she knew she was likely to do it.
"A lot of people think there is something wrong with this picture. Can you guess what?"
"There is no color?"
He laughed. "No, it's supposed to be in black and white."
She shrugged.
"Well, people like this photo because it's sort of one of a kind. See, Malcolm is smiling and Muhammad looks very serious, doesn't he?"
"He does."
"But those men were known for just the opposite. Muhammad Ali was always saying colorful things. He was always being quoted in the press before and after fights. He was the one who said, 'Float like a butterfly and sting like a bee.'"
She had heard that before and nodded to show it.
"But Malcolm, everyone thought that Malcolm was always very serious and always very angry."
"Was he?"
"He could be. He was a fiery speaker, just like Martin Luther King Jr. But some people did not like Malcolm X as much. They were scared of him. He channeled a lot of anger, but justified anger."
She examined the picture, scanning back and forth between the handsome man with the horn-rimmed glasses, whose face was open, friendly, and full of delight, and Ali, intent on the task of signing his autograph. "Malcolm looks nice."
"He was. He could be. He had daughters like you that he loved very much. He was a good father, but this picture tells you something important. Do you know what it is?
She stared again into the picture, a little helpless, unsure as to what more he wanted her to extract from this lesson. Fortunately, he threw her a lifeline.
It tells you, Kenya, that no one is just one thing.
The bus stopped and the engine cut. Kenya opened her eyes as the passengers were standing and pulling their belongings from the overhead storage rack. The driver stepped down off the bus and swung open the luggage doors just under the windows. "There's Grandma," the white woman in the North Carolina state sweatshirt said to her son. Kenya caught sight of a woman who, despite her gray hair, appeared quite spry. Stretching up to wave, a pair of fluorescent pink bifocals hanging around her neck. She was eclipsed from view as another luggage door swung open. Beyond, Kenya saw a red brick church with a bell tower, a leafy park with a bandstand, and a street with long rows of low storefronts with picture windows. "Have a nice day," the mother said to Kenya, as Kenya waited for them to step into the aisle. The boy looked up, a bit wary of her as a stranger, but returned her smile and wave before he began to follow his mother. As she turned, a red and yellow Iron Man figurine slipped out of his backpack. Kenya picked it up and called to him. "Excuse me, I think you dropped Tony Stark," she said. The boy turned, his eyes growing large, and ran back to retrieve his toy. Somehow, the exchange seemed to alleviate her stranger danger status. Emboldened, he asked, "Do you like the Avengers?" "Sure," she said. "Black Panther is my favorite." "Colton, you are holding people up," his mother said when she found he was not following. He obeyed, although no one seemed to mind the holdup. His mother smiled and thanked Kenya. Kenya smiled in return and followed in their wake, stepping down the stairs onto the cracked tarmac of the parking lot. The air was fresh, if a bit humid. Her immediate impression of Selah Station was that its buildings were low. The highest was 3 stories, with the exception of the church bell tower, which was more like 4. She noted a lot of not-so-small waistlines, blue jeans, and stretch pants among the white people waiting to greet family members. One man was actually wearing overalls and a green John Deere hat, which she guessed was better than a Make America Great Again hat. She wondered if all eyes were on her, the only black girl, one with braids no less. Her mind flashed back to the words scratched into the historical marker. "Go home, nigger." The driver pulled her suitcase from the storage bins beneath the bus. She claimed it, her fingernails digging into padding of the handle as she took it, and turned to face the town she would be spending the next 3 months in. For better or for worse, this is my country too, she thought.